coming down like a snow globe out there, but it's very pretty. We had no snow falling in Grand Rapids when we left this morning, so I don't know whether it'll make its way over there or not, but it is good to be back. I do want to express my profound appreciation to Terry Gleason and to Dr. John Marco for filling the pulpit in my absence. My only concern with Terry was that she spoke for about 20 minutes. Terry, you're killing me here. I need a little more. Don't get him used to that, okay? But then John came in. He spoke for about 40 or so that was good. So we're back to normal. But no, seriously, thank you to Terry. Thank you, Terry, for filling in, and also for John as well. John was honored and appreciated the opportunity to share the Word of God with you. We are looking at a series for a short one, actually, this time, only about a month, and that is basically what I'm calling here the art of neighboring, all right there, okay? And we're kicking this off with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I want to talk about that parable today and give you some insights to it, and you're very familiar with it. In fact, it is arguable that this particular parable of Jesus may be, if not the best known, certainly one of the very best known parables that our Lord gave during his ministry. This is found in Luke chapter 10, so if you want to either take your Bible or there's a Bible in the pew that you can avail yourself of and look at this particular passage. And we are familiar with the story. There are basically 4 individuals who are involved in this story. There is a man. That's all we're told about him. We don't know what he was or who he was. Now, again, it's a parable, so there may not be an actual historical event. In fact, there very likely isn't. There may be, in that I'm sure that, my wife and I had the privilege of being in that part of Israel about 20 years ago, back in March of 1998, to take that road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And it's an interesting one. It goes down, down, down. You're going from Jerusalem down, and it's very rugged terrain. It's what we would call the Judean wilderness. Unfortunately, we use the word wilderness, we think of trees, and forest. No, this is barren. It's wild, okay? It's wilderness. There's nothing there, just rocks and hills and so forth. And some of them are quite steep when you're driving this little road that off to the side of the vehicle. We were in one place, it's like 1,000-foot drop. And our bus driver was very good. He was very good at getting right up to the edge and making you think he was going to drive off the edge. But he didn't, but he certainly made a few of us and a few folks in the bus uncomfortable. I thought it was awesome. We were actually in front of the right wheel, so we were actually hanging out. Look at that! Wow, that's cool, And so we're fine. We survived the fall. There was no fall. We're fine. But it's a very threatening kind of area. It's an area where there were a lot of thieves, muggers, we would probably call them today. Now, what you have today is you have some beggars along the way, and you get off your bus for a few minutes at one point, and these people run up to you, and you're supposed to barter with them. I have a little stuffed toy, $5, you give me, and then you're supposed to say, how about 2? About 4, and you go back and forth. And we had one guy in our group that was always, whatever they asked for, he'd pay that much. And we told him that's not the way it's supposed to work, okay? So it's the worst thing that can happen to you for the most part there is maybe you spend a little more money than what you really needed to. But that was not the case in the first century. And so we have this particular parable. Now, I've got to say a few things about parables because they are one of the most fascinating aspects of Jesus' teaching. In fact, there's one place in the Gospels where it says that unless he spoke in a parable, he never spoke to the people. Now, that's at that particular time in that particular scenario. Because parables were designed really to do 2 things. They were to explain and further reveal truth to those who accepted the message. But they were also designed to conceal truth from those who refused to accept it. It's also worth noting Jesus did not invent parables. He was not the first person to speak in parables. The Pharisees used parables. In fact, there are a number of parables in the Old Testament. Perhaps the most famous parable in the Old Testament is the one that Nathan told David after David sent for Bathsheba, committed adultery with her, fathered a child. with her and then had her husband put to death. And Nathan, the prophet, came to David sometime after this, because after Uriah was killed in battle and David set that up to get rid of him, to get him out of the way, after that took place, then Nathan, at the end of 2 Samuel 11, the whole story is there. Her husband Uriah is killed in battle. David takes her to be his wife. But then the very last phrase of 2 Samuel 11, one of the great understatements of the Bible, but the thing that David did displeased the Lord. Okay, really? I think we figured that one out, but it's there. That's what it says. Now, a little while later, Nathan the prophet comes up to David, and he says, David, King David, there are two men in your kingdom. One is very wealthy, and one is very poor. And the wealthy man, who had flocks and herds of all sorts, invited a friend over for dinner. But instead of taking an animal from his own flock, he took from the second man here, who was very poor, and he just had one little lamb. And he held it, and it sat in his lap like a daughter to him. Instead of taking from his own flocks, he took this man's little lamb, and he killed it, and he dressed it, and they had it for dinner. Now, by the way, an interesting thing in the Hebrew Bible, the word for daughter is Bath, B-A-T-H. The first syllable of the name Bathsheba, okay, Bathsheba. And so when Nathan says that he had this little lamb, but he treated it like a bath, David should have picked up on that, but he didn't. Okay? And David says, why, the man who has done this will die. And Nathan looked at David and said, you are the man. That's a parable, okay? Interesting about parables is that parables, we talk about interpreting parables, but parables often interpret us. That's the scary thing about some scriptures. They just lay you bare, okay? There was no way that David could get out of that situation. He had, in fact, convicted himself, unbeknownst, right? He had made that sort of statement. So parables are everywhere. They're in the Old Testament. Now, what's interesting about the Gospel of John, and we'll look at this when we get to the Gospel of John in a few weeks in our Bible study. By the way, we are planning to have that this afternoon at 4 o'clock. If you can make it, that's great. I understand the weather is a little dicey, and that might be a concern, but we do want to have the Bible study at 4 o'clock this afternoon, so if you're available. But in the Gospel of John, there are no parables. Jesus is not, there are no parables. John does not include any of Jesus' parables in the Gospel of John. Kind of interesting, right? Now, I'm going to run through this list real quickly. You've got this on your handout, and I'm not going to go into any detail at all here on these next couple of slides. But just a couple facts, some facts about this parable. First of all, it is one of a number of parables that are only found in Luke. You're only going to find parables of Jesus in Matthew and Mark and Luke, none in John. There are a few that are in Luke that are also in Matthew or Mark, and Mark, but there's a whole bunch of them that are only in Luke. It's kind of interesting that these parables, and here are some of them, okay? The parable of the two debtors. Remember the two guys that both owed a lot of money? And the one guy who owed a lot was forgiven, and then he insisted the other guy pay him a little that he owed him. Remember that one? The parable of the friend at midnight. The persistent friend at midnight. Nancy and I got home at midnight on our last flight, and when we got home, we grabbed the one suitcase, left the rest of the stuff in the car. We were not in any mood or shape to host anybody, okay? Hey, can we come over for a couple hours? And no. Sorry, we're going to be unconscious very soon, okay? The parable of the rich fool. Right? What will I do? I've got, my barns are full. I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, okay? Only in Luke. The parable of the severe and light beatings. That sounds like a rather ominous parable, but check it out. It's just a short one. The parable of the barren tree. The parable of the guests, and the two parables of guests and hosts. All right, these are all there. You can look them up on your time. The parable of the lost coin. The parable of the lost son. We sometimes call him the prodigal son. By the way, to show you how sometimes we struggle with parables, the son who is ultimately at odds with his dad is not the younger one, it's the older one. If you're looking for a bad guy in the parable of the prodigal son, it's not the younger one. Didn't he take all his dad's money and go off and waste it on what the King James Bible euphemistically calls riotous living? Yes, he did. But he came back and asked for forgiveness. The older brother was never reconciled to his father. Interesting parable. Parable of the shrewd manager. That's an interesting one as well. Parable, maybe it's a story, because there's no other parables in the Bible where a character in the parable is actually given a name. But here, Lazarus, okay, the rich man, whether it's the same Lazarus as the Lazarus in the Gospel of John, we don't know. The parable of the widow and the judge. Remember the persistent widow, okay? The judge who did not fear God and had no respect for people, but the woman just came nagging all the time. Right? The parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. That's one of my favorite ones. Right? If you can have a favorite scripture passage. These are all unique to Luke. These are not found anywhere else except in the Gospel of Luke. Now, how do we interpret the parables? Let's just say a couple things about that real quickly before we take a look at this particular parable. Throughout the history of the church, and particularly for the first, from the time of Augustine, who died in 430 A.D., up until the time of John Calvin, that's about 1,000 years, a little more than 1,000 years. Parables were interpreted allegorically. They were allegories. In other words, every detail in the parable actually was thought to correspond to some other detail or some other point of emphasis. You're familiar with the allegories. The most famous allegory is, of course, in English, is John Newton's book, Pilgrim's Progress. This is actually an allegory. It's a very thinly veiled allegory. How many of you ever read Pilgrim's Progress, or at least read part of it? Yeah, I see a number of you have, okay? This is a story about Christian who is on his journey to the celestial city, and he enters the Slough of Despond. He comes to Doubting Castle. He runs into a couple of characters named Obstinate and Pliable, all right? And it doesn't take a whole lot, and Christian lays his burden at the cross. It doesn't take a whole lot of analysis to figure out what's going on here. A lot of people for hundreds and hundreds of years interpreted the parables as allegories, right? The parable of the Good Samaritan has a long history of allegorical interpretation. And it goes back to a guy named Origen. It's interesting. It originates with a guy named Origen, all right? Now, Origen died in the year 254, so way back, okay? This was his, and other people picked up on this. I've heard sermons, right, that include this interpretation. Here is an allegorical interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan, all right? Hang on for a little bit of a ride here. So who are these characters in this parable? Well, the man who is going down to Jerusalem, remember the man goes from Jerusalem to Jericho, so the man who is going down is Adam. Jerusalem represents paradise. Jericho represents the world. The robbers are hostile powers or demons. The priest represents the law. The Levite represents the prophets. And the Samaritan represents Jesus. The wounds are sin or disobedience. The beast, the donkey, represents the body of Jesus, the incarnation. The wounds are disobedience. The beast is the Lord's body. The inn, which accepts all who wish to enter, represents the church. Remember, he takes the man to the inn? The manager of the inn is the head of the church. And various interpreters have said, oh, that represents the Apostle Paul. Now, how in the world Jesus could have been standing there and telling this parable, and the people that heard it said, oh, I bet he's talking about the Apostle Paul. Okay? When there was no Apostle Paul, there would not be for a few years. Okay? The fact that the Samaritan promises that he will return represents the second coming of Jesus, Origen. That's his interpretation. With all due respect to Origen, okay, I think he's reading meanings into the text that simply are not there. For the most part, allegorical interpretation of parables is something that we invent. It's not something that's in the parables themselves, right? So what's the second way to look at the parable? Well, the second way is what we call the one main point method. There's dressing, there's details, there's real-life settings, all of which are helpful and give us insight, but there is a one main point method of interpreting the parables, all right? The parables are vibrant stories with exciting features, but they are intended to communicate one main point. There are a couple things about this parable that make it very interesting. First of all, it starts off with the man's question, who then is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Who's my neighbor? Right? That is the question the parable was intended to ask. There's one other word upon which the meaning of this parable really resonates or hangs, and that is the word Samaritan. We are so used to the idea of Samaritan in our context that we think that Samaritan is ipso facto just simply a good person. Every Samaritan was wonderful. Okay? The priest passes by, leaves the man bleeding and perhaps dying. The Levite passes by, leaves the man dying, but the Samaritan, okay? So we have organizations, very fine organizations, very good organizations. One of them is called Samaritan's Purse. You've probably heard of that. Okay? There's another one called Samaritan's Carriage. That was one that I think, I'm not sure if it's local, but when my dad was in assisted living for the few months or a year and a half before he died, they had a group that would come to the nursing home, and they would take people to see things, get them out in the fresh air, take them to see the John Ball Zoo. They put them in wheelchairs and whatever, and it was called Samaritan's Carriage. We'd take these people out so they can have a good time and a good afternoon. Okay? When you hear the word Samaritan in the parable of the Good Samaritan, that's not what you're supposed to think. You got to read it through the culture of 2,000 years ago. Depending on your political alliances, all right, I'm going to speak to both sides of the aisle right now, okay? Not this aisle, but the political, well, I am, but speaking to both sides of the aisle, but I'm speaking to okay? So if this is the right side and this is the left side, for your perspective, this is the right side. This would be the conservative side, okay? This would be the Republican predominantly over here. No rhinos over here, just Republicans, all right? Over here would be the Democrats, all right? So if this people, we tell the parable to them, we would say this. We would say, well, the priest and the Levite passed by, but a Democrat. And the Democrat did really good things for him and helped him out. And you're like, what? Okay. Now over here, I would say the good Republican, okay? Good Republican, aren't they the ones that want to starve people and all this sort of stuff, you know? And they just love their rich buddies, and you know, on and on. It'd give you the whole, but it would shock you. It would catch your attention. The main point of any parable is often found in the point that shocks you or surprises you. So when a priest or a Levite passes by, and there are technically some very good reasons why the priest and the Levite would pass by. To touch a dead body would make them ceremonially unclean. And that would limit their ability to do what they need to do until they could take the time out to become clean. So you can kind of, maybe you're not real pleased, but you kind of sort of understand. But then a Samaritan? Okay? It's like saying the good prostitute or the good drug dealer. So this man was lying there, and here comes El Chapo, you know, the great Mexican drug lord. And he helps the guy out, and he treats him better than any of the religious leaders do. You're like, what? That's how that would have been perceived by them. To say the good Samaritan would have been for them an oxymoron. And therein is where the point of the parable lies. Again, as we said, they're vibrant stories, exciting features, but they are intended to communicate one idea. In this case, the parable is precipitated by the expert in the law's question, and who is my neighbor? We'll look at the conversation that took place here in just a moment. But first of all, I want to tell you, this is going to be my theme for the next month or so, and that is, who is my neighbor? How do we treat our neighbors? I'm working through a book right now called The Art of Neighboring. It's a very easy read. I rode on the plane from Florida to Chicago, and I got about 2/3 of the way through it in about 2.5 hours, right? So it wasn't that bad at all when I wasn't, you know, dozing off or whatever. But the book is called The Art of Neighboring by Jay Pathak and Dave Runyon. And the next couple weeks, I want to look at some ideas, some biblical perspectives, what it looks like for you and me to be neighbors. We're talking about neighbors around our own homes. We're talking about neighbors in our community, right? One of the reasons that Nancy and I enjoy being up here during the summer, and one of the reasons why, for example, we have the yard sale over here, at the lighthouse is so that we can get to know some of the people in the community. Okay? And I've had a couple times where people have stopped by and they say, "Aren't you Smith?" "Yeah." "Yeah, Professor Smith, right?" "Yeah." "Well, I was in your class 20 years ago." And I'm like, "Go away. You're not the one I want to talk to." Okay? I want to talk to people that don't know the Lord, that haven't heard the gospel. No, I don't do that, but I think about it. Okay? So I would encourage you, this book is, if you're interested at all in getting a copy of it, I would encourage you to do it. I think it's just a good book to have in your library. And he talks about things like the barriers to reaching out to your neighbors. One is time. Okay? The other one is we tend to be a little distrusting of people that we don't know. He makes the point, or one of the authors makes the point at the beginning of the book. My wife loves to watch, Flip or Flop or whatever it is, or one of those shows like that, or what's the other one with Chip and Joanna in? That's what's that show called? Yeah, Fixer Upper. Okay, and he makes the point that they're fascinating shows, and people look at the house and say, well, what's the bathroom like? What's the bedroom like? How big is it? How big? But he said that one of the questions they never ask is who lives next door. Because that can really be a significant thing in terms of getting a house. And he's right. I understand what the shows are about. I like watching them too a little bit. But that's the way it goes, the art of neighboring. Okay? Do we even know our neighbors? Do we even know our neighbors? Right? Some of you live next door to people that come to the church here, so yeah, you know your neighbor. But do you even know your neighbors? Do you know their name? Okay? Do you know anything about them at all? Do you know that maybe they're kind of grouchy and kind of grumpy sometimes? But do you maybe know why? What's their life journey? What are their struggles? What are their challenges? Have you taken the time to get to know your neighbors? Good question for all of us. Okay? Now, let me just look in the last few minutes that we have here at some information from this parable. First of all, the parable is introduced by a back and forth conversation between an expert in the law of Moses. The King James Bible refers to him as a lawyer. Okay? So he drove a RMW chariot. RMW stands for Rome Motor Works, and no, not really. He's a rich guy. No, that's not what that means, okay? It's not a lawyer like somebody who goes to court. Somebody who is an expert in the law of Moses. So when, in Fiddler on the Roof, when they say, "Rabbi, is there a blessing for the Tsar?" And the rabbi says, "A blessing for the Tsar. Let's see. May the Lord bless and keep the Tsar far away from us." Right? That's his prayer. That's not in the Bible, but that's his little made up little prayer. But he's an expert. So you ask him questions about, well, what does this mean? What does that mean? And he can tell you, right? So he has this conversation with Jesus. In fact, it says on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus, right? So the guy's motives are not pure. He's trying to test Jesus. He's trying to catch him. He's like certain reporters at a White House press conference, and that applies for either party, by the way. Trying to get somebody to say something that they can then grasp onto and accuse them of whatever, okay? Because media have political agendas, as do politicians. Right? So he stands up to test Jesus. He says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "What do you read in the law? What does the Torah say?" Okay? How do you read it? He says, "Love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." That's a good answer. That's a very good answer. He doesn't say things like, I have to keep certain commandments. I have to, obey certain purity laws. I have to obey the Sabbath. Because there were a lot of Pharisees that said that. In the Gospel of John, in John chapter 9, when the Pharisees bring in and confront the man who was born blind, who Jesus has healed, they say, this man can't be from God, talking about Jesus, because he doesn't keep the Sabbath law. Right? So that's their conclusion. That's not where this guy is coming from. Now, his motives maybe are not pure, but his answer is pretty good compared to some other possible answers that he could have given or that others gave. Right? It is clear that the expert in the law does not want to submit to Jesus, but he wants to one-up him. He's testing him. He wants to see if he can catch him in a misinterpretation of the law. So that's what he does. Now, to answer this man, Jesus tells him the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is loaded with cultural references that are not necessarily familiar to us. Right? So, in verse 30, Well, actually, let's back up before that. Jesus says, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself. Basically, he wanted to make himself look good. He'd been sort of embarrassed by Jesus. So he's testing Jesus. What does the law say? Well, this is what it says. Well, you're right. That's right. Oh, well, I'm going to respond by trying to justify himself. And he asks the question, and who is my neighbor? That is the question that prompts this parable. So obviously, Jesus intends for this parable to answer that question. Who is my neighbor? So Jesus says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, someone who had a different Bible, the Samaritan Pentateuch, there was different of content. They had their own version of the Old Testament. Instead of Isaac being the one that was nearly sacrificed, and you go on and on. Okay, there's all sorts of variations. This was their Bible. They were alienated. They were strange. We know that the Jews avoided going through Samaria when they went somewhere. We get a lot of this from John chapter 4, the story of the woman at the well. She says to Jesus, well, you're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan. Why are you asking me for a drink of water? You couldn't even ask for a drink of water. You just had nothing to do with them. I remember when I was growing up, I was speaking to one of the young people that I was in school with, and somebody from my church that I was going to Boys Brigade to said, do you know her? And I said, yeah, we go to the same school. And he says, well, did you know that she's Catholic? Now, I was like 8 years old. I had no idea what that even meant. And I says, well, what? Okay. Well, it said they read the Apocrypha. I had no idea what the Apocrypha was, but it sounded really bad. Some sort of dirty books or something. Now, it's not, okay? But that was the cultural perception for many in the church with which I grew up, at least in the early years. Okay? The good Roman Catholic, right? To my Baptist ears, that would have sounded extremely strange. But that's what Jesus is challenging us to do. He's challenging us to think outside of those cultural paradigms, those cultural ways of seeing things. Because when we hear the good Samaritan, we think, well, of course, all Samaritans are good. No, they weren't, at least not in the minds and hearts of the Jews and the Jewish people. Okay? What does the Samaritan do? He comes by where he was, saw him, took pity on him, went to him, bandaged his wounds, poured oil and wine on them. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, which is like 2 days' wages. Not a lot of money, but it's a lot of money. Okay? And he gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I'll reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Okay? So who comes off looking really good in this parable? It's not the priest or the Levite. It's and you almost have to sneer when you say it, it's the Samaritan. Okay? Now what you're doing when you do that sneer is you're thinking about the Samaritans the way the Jews would. Samaritan. Okay? You're thinking about, the Democrat when you're a Republican. Well, that's a Democrat. Or you're thinking about a Republican when you're a Democrat. Okay? Republican. Okay? So who really, how many times have you watched the political debate? You say, well, who do you think won the debate? Well, I think the other guy won the debate. Okay? You're not real happy about it, and you're not real willing to. So who is neighbor to him? Now you notice when the guy answers the question, oh, the Samaritan. Is that what he says? No. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Jesus cuts to the chase. Okay? I felt like using idioms and common phrases today. Jesus cuts to the chase. He cuts through all the nonsense. He cuts through all the cultural baggage. And he asks the expert in the law, which of these 3 was neighbor to the man who fell among the thieves? Who really helped him? It didn't matter. In fact, it's kind of ironic that it was actually the Samaritan. It would have been one thing if the Samaritan fell among thieves and he was beaten up and somebody else came to help him. The Jewish person came to help him. But it's the other way around. It's the Samaritan who actually showed, and he goes out of his way. Not only that, but he says, this will do for now. This is all I got on me, okay? But when I come back again, whatever it is, you let me know and I'll pay the balance. The man's answer, which Jesus affirms, okay? Which one was neighbor? The one that treated him with mercy. Jesus' answer affirms and indicates that neighborliness transcends any and all cultural and religious boundaries. If we are going to be serious about being neighbors, if we are going to be serious about reaching out to the people around us, and we're going to talk about some ways to do this in the next couple weeks, we need to realize we're going to run to some people that are, this is not what I was expecting. This is not what I signed up for. That's not necessarily to impugn or insult anybody else. It's just to say that we like people who are like us. I mean, who doesn't like people that are like us? It's very easy for us to come together on a Sunday morning and just have our little club because we're all good. Yeah, we've all got our little crazinesses and idiosyncrasies and all that, idiosyncrasies and all that, but at least we know what they are, okay? We've gotten kind of used to each other as best we can. I remember I ran across this phrase a long time ago, and I wasn't sure, and I looked it up, did some research on it, and I found out that William Temple, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, as was his father many, many years ago, he made this statement. I don't know, you can't quite see it all there, but here's what it says. The church is the only organization in the world that exists primarily for the benefit of its non-members. The church is the only organization in the world that exists primarily for the benefit of its non-members. Now, again, there is indeed, this is what we call body life, okay? There is body life. It is important that we in the church, we care for one another, okay? So this is all an important thing. But in order to keep growing, we have to keep reaching out to those who are around us. So we need to make sure that we care for those who are our non-members, who are our neighbors. Who do we reach out to? What is our strategy? Okay? This is what we want to try to do in the future going forward. I would love 2018 to be the year that First Baptist Church, I don't want to say discovered, but the year that First Baptist Church truly reached out to their neighbors. Both saved and unsaved, okay? You probably have neighbors that are believers that don't attend church regularly. Maybe they used to and they don't go there anymore. Invite them. But you maybe have neighbors who don't know Christ. And what an opportunity to bring them here and let them see the gospel, not just in theory or hear it preached, but hear it actually, see how it's actually lived out. Okay? Now, in another 3 weeks, 3 weeks from today, we're going to have an annual event here at First Baptist Church. It's going to be our football Sunday. We can't use the name of the actual game because the NFL owns it. They don't want us to use it. Okay? We're going to show you a video. We're going to have the video instead of a sermon. See, there's a reason to come right there. No pastor preaching, okay? We're going to get some football players. February 4th, 2018. And this is going to be an informal day. We're going to do some tailgating out in the foyer, right? We're going to have like a tailgate thing set up. Put on your jersey. If you got a jersey for your favorite team that's in the Super Bowl, wear it, okay? Come relax. Just come and enjoy the day. This is going to be definitely going to be one of those kind of days. February 4th, 10:30 in the morning. But I want to encourage you to invite your neighbors. Okay? And it may be, some of them may come, some of them may not. It may be a challenge. It may be a struggle to get them to come because there are folks that, this is why home Bible studies and small groups are such wonderful things. Because people who don't know the Lord will often come to somebody's house that they know rather than go to church, because going to church is kind of intimidating to them. But let them know. Give them, there's a website with I think there's a trailer for this, and there's other information. But this is an excellent way to start to reach out. I would like to challenge each one of us to talk to one neighbor who maybe you haven't talked to very much or maybe not at all and say, hey, if you're interested, the game's not till 6 o'clock at night, so they're not going to miss the game.